When I play with people who are new to TTRPGs, more specifically D&D, one of the most interesting things to me is that if a player is used to video games, they will often have a somewhat visceral reaction when it comes to facing death in a game. In video games, the expectation is that the character respawns good as new whenever they die. They may have lost some progress, but they are overall unchanged. The designers of a video game don't want the new player to stop playing, and often don't have the time or inclination to create a whole new character whenever the player's actions result in their first character dying. Even roguelike video games, which force you to start over when you die, don't usually require you to name, write a backstory about, and act out each new character. When a player who is used to respawning experiences their first death in an RPG, there is some shock. Oh no, actual reversible consequences in a game. The instinct is to start over and try again, but often that can't happen within the rules of a TTRPG. And that really sucks for the player, because from a certain perspective, all the time and thought they put into their character is lost. Inaccessible now. Tear the character sheet up, throw it in a fire, they're gone. And the consequences go beyond that. That player could have actually been hurt by the experience. I've had games in which a character has died. There's often tears, frustration, grief. Players mourn their fallen characters. It's a major clue of how much these games can affect people. But it's also deeply concerning. With such a powerful tool at the game master's disposal, when do we use it? And what for? When does death enter the picture? Today I'm going to talk about death in RPGs. I'm not sure I'll have all the answers as to when to kill a character, but I sure will talk about it, how it's used in different games, what an RPG's rules about death say about the rest of the game. Let's cover a few things about death as it relates to RPGs. I think one of the key aspects about death is its permanence. A death not only takes away the present experience with the deceased, but all future experiences as well. Death means that the other characters in the game are going to react to it. A death could shift the mood of a game. It could change the other characters. In the best RPGs, death is the catalyst for character growth. Just, not for the character who died because of the whole dead thing. On the opposite end, there's nothing more awkward than a lingering presence of a mundane death. At a table of players, there may not be any inclination to roleplay darker, more serious instances like death. Or perhaps the weight of the death wasn't there, or the appeal of the dead character was lacking in the first place. The death of a character could be gainful for some, and troubling for others at the same time. Many players have experienced a killing for convenience, where they're done with their own character, and death's permanence can get rid of their character without compromising the narrative. The random chance of death happening at any moment means that it can also happen at the exact right time if the GM or players so choose. Death as a concept is highly universal, so if an RPG is about people, it's likely that there are rules for death or injury. Let's dive into how these RPGs treat death. First of all, and most popular, D&D, Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition tracks a creature's physical well-being through hit points, as I'm sure many of you are familiar. If your character's hit points drop 2 or below 0, they are unconscious and start making death saving throws, which each have roughly a 50% chance of success. If you fail 3, you die. If you succeed 3, you stabilize. If you take damage while making death saves, you automatically fail 1 death save, or 2 if it's critical hit. These rules make it so the average D&D powerhouse can keep on trucking without issue, even if their hit points say they're at the edge of life. Any number of hit points that is not 0 or lower might as well be full health from a gameplay perspective. In this way, 5e does not want to deliberate or punish actions that are risky or dangerous by inflicting injuries or penalties, because it wants the characters to be able to flex their muscles until they die. Now, that's a funny point with D&D. Dungeons & Dragons has a mechanic that I haven't seen much in other RPGs that don't share D&D's aesthetic. Resurrection. In Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, characters come back to life fairly frequently. From 3rd level, some characters have access to a spell called Gentle Repose that extends the duration of which corpses can be resurrected. 5th level and beyond find certain classes accessing spells like Revivify, Raise Dead, Resurrection, Reincarnation, True Resurrection. All of these spells do roughly the same thing, which is return a dead creature to life. And they do it for corpses that have been dead for longer based on the spell used. Revivify can only resurrect the dead if they were alive less than a minute ago. Raise Dead if they were alive 10 days ago. So on and so forth. From a gameplay perspective, this increasingly easy access to resurrection means that as a player invests time in their character from level 1 to 20, their investment becomes more and more secure, to the extent where a high-level party only finds death as a minor inconvenience that could be solved today, if not tomorrow, with the right spells and some diamonds. Personally, if I were designing a mechanic that preserves player investment, I wouldn't really hide it in the spell section, but rather make it a core aspect of the experience that is plainly visible to new players. Maybe a class feature or something with a little blurb as to how the clerics out in the world can resurrect people, or something like that. Mork Borg is an extremely metal RPG not meant for the faint of heart. In Mork Borg, you are a dungeon crawling, looting madman who can die at any moment, always. This is the extreme where we have gone from death as an obstacle to be overcome, to death as something that is more or less unavoidable. And if you've managed to stave off death for a few sessions, you are either insanely lucky, or very poor. Mork Borg takes the easy come, easy go approach to character creation. Nearly everything in Mork Borg is decided by random table, and your character's past, feelings, long-term aspirations are not nearly as important as what extremely metal activities they can get up to before they die or before the world ends. Mork Borg is to RPGs what a Nuzlocke is to Pokemon. In Mork Borg, your character begins with 1d8 hit points. One hit point being a perfectly valid and equally likely option. If you are reduced to 0 hit points, you are broken and will either recover at some point or just die later. If your hit points are negative, you just straight up die. Mork Borg takes an approach that leads me to believe that the game aims for stories about playing the game, rather than stories about the characters themselves. A more detached experience. Put on a silly voice and do some stupid metal shit with your friends. Death is swift and unforgiving because that's where the excitement of the game is drawn from. If Pergy Fuckbucket survives, it'll be fucking awesome. On the other end of the spectrum, there's Fate Core, which has mechanics for stress and consequences, but doesn't really mention death as a concrete mechanic. Each attack in Fate has a shift value. If you are hit by an attack, you are taken out of the conflict if you cannot absorb the hit with stress or consequences. In this way, the game allows players access to their characters without risk of that access being taken away through death or other means. Even a penalty like consequence is a choice to be made by the player to determine how their character will be affected narratively by a dangerous attack. When your character is taken out, it is up to the character who bested your character, ostensibly the game master, to decide what happens to them. This means that instead of the game enforcing death, it's up to the game master alone to deal it out when appropriate, and ideally with your player's consent. Alternatively, you can choose to concede a conflict to lose without jeopardizing your character's life or well-being. You can do this even when you're about to be taken out. Very forgiving, very dramatic. Agon is an RPG about Greek heroes who venture out on a mythic quest. The game focuses on legendary deeds of these heroes in epic fashion. A hero can end their journey in a few ways in Agon, but only one of those ways involves death, necessarily. When your hero fails a contest with a foe, they can choose to sacrifice themselves to instead achieve victory. Dying to win a battle is something deeply intrinsic to stories about heroes, but I haven't seen many games offer a mechanic quite like this one. In Agon, death is never forced upon a hero, but you as the player can choose to give your hero a memorable ending by having them die for something or someone heroic. So at this point, you may have noticed that some of the fun ways to handle death in RPGs are to not have it happen unless the player chooses. And yeah, this makes sense. Death in role-playing games can be fun, but in order for it to be fun, it has to develop the story in a way that is satisfying to the player and the rest of the table. If it doesn't do that, then it has to be solved somewhat easily, like in DnD. A new character, a resurrection, a comeback. It needs to be a painless process to get going again. This is why in roguelike video games, they make restarting as simple as the press of a button. One of the main points you need to know in order to find out where death fits in your game is whether your game is meant to challenge the players or tell them a story. Often games do both, but the choice of killing a character or letting them live despite their failings is a rather binary decision. If the party is caught by the guard while they're in the act of murder, assuming they're outmatched, do they live or do they die? I've found that when I make that decision in the moment, the players feel like they've been treated unfairly, that I'm manipulating the rules in a way that an impartial DM would not. So I think it would help to come up with a defined way that your table handles death in your game. Another question is, does the system you are running rely on death for its tension? If the party is saved every time they get in deep trouble, why do their actions even matter? Sometimes without the threat of death, a game loses its luster. Other times, players need to know that they can make poor decisions and take risks without fearing the worst punishment. Your house rules for death may not be consistent even within the same RPG, as different characters come to the table with different desires for their experience regardless of the RPG you're playing. This is something you should definitely talk to your players about. The sooner you all know the answers to these questions, the better. And that's my video about death. I hope you guys could use these helpful tips. I mean, I didn't really give a whole lot of tips, more just like general advice. Hopefully I got your brain thinking about this stuff. If you like this video, please consider subscribing and supporting me on Patreon. For my $3 a month tier, I'll give you a shout out at the end of each video. This is where I put my patrons, if I had them. And you'll get to vote on upcoming videos and articles and TikToks. So, I think that's it. So long.